Good morning. It's Glenn with War for the West back at you today, this time with a deeper dive on the actual strategy the U.S. has in Ukraine and against Russia. This is going to be longer. This is a think piece. This is not a quick 30-second video. Grab a coffee and listen to this because this is a story that you aren't getting told that you need to know about why we are in the mess we are in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and against Russia. After the end of the Cold War, or better said, the fall of the Soviet Union, because the Cold War never ended. That's one of the key messages here, by the way. Um, what you find is that there's a set of people in our government who disagree about how to treat Russia, and there are different forces advocating for a very aggressive approach towards Russia, and others who are advocating for a peaceful approach towards Russia. What's true at the time is that nobody thought Russia was a threat to the US or Europe at all in the 90s. There was no threat at all possible in those days. So there was never coming from a threat concept. And what happened is there's a guy who got involved in U.S. foreign policy who's been influential in Democrat circles since the Carter years in the 70s, right? Late 70s. Zbigniew Brzezinski is a guy you probably know very little about. You may have occasionally heard his name. By the way, Mika Brzezinski is his daughter. Her claim to fame as a journalist and media personality, and really in any of these circles, is based on her dad. Just so you know, she's like you're watching like the girl child of an actual famous man get credibility for no reason because she's a freaking idiot. Brzezinski's brilliant. There's no question about that. But brilliant people are more dangerous than anybody else in these kind of settings because they will come up with harebrained schemes that actually sound plausible. That's exactly what Brzezinski did here. And I think it's really worth you understanding how his framing and changing of how we deal with Russia changed our policy and set us on this path beginning in the late 90s of expanding NATO. And basically, what we wanted to do was lock Russia up so it couldn't expand at all and surround it while it was weak. That was our strategy. And I want to tell you how we got there, okay? By going in and taking a look at Zbigniew Brzezinski's worldview. I'm going to do a bit of reading here, not too much. I hope this isn't too intolerable, but it's really important that that you understand this, and then you will see where we were at, where we're at today, how we got there, and what it's worth. I'm trying to get this blown up right so we can okay. The American Polish scholar Zbigniew Brzezinski has proven to be, by the way, he's Polish, one of the most insightful geostrategists, old guard Kremlinologists, and futurologists of the 20th and 21st centuries. He contributed to forming a coherent strategy for the United States that aimed at dismantling the Soviet bloc and liberating Central and Eastern Europe from Russian Soviet sphere of influence. He pressed for toughness with the Soviets throughout the Carter administration and was very skeptical about the possibility of long-lasting peace in Eastern Europe. Though more than 70 years of his professional career, Brzezinski mastered the art of deducing, observing, uncovering several very important patterns in global politics. He was convinced that the United States is destined to preserve its status as the first and last truly global superpower, but he warned that this outcome cannot be taken for granted. His critics accused him of being a hardliner who never stopped portraying the global reality is a bipolar competition between two superpowers. But Brzezinski respectfully disagreed and was quite persistent in warning the U.S. political establishment against the Fukuyama's triumphalist claim that the end of history was fast approaching after the collapse of the Soviet Union. If you don't know what that is, don't get hung up on it. The end of history is a term that intellectuals use to talk about theories of politics that reside in something called historicism. So this is a term of art from the academic world of international relations that you don't need to worry about or get distracted in. To the outrage of liberal international relations theorists and many Washington insiders who were in a celebratory mood well before after 91, Brzezinski saw the weakness of the Yeltsin administration not as an indicator that Russia would be permanently satisfied with a new role as geopolitical outsider, committed to the voluntary constraint of its military during the collapse of its economy and complete and utter evaporation of national pride. To him, Russia was not a giant on rusted legs, but a force to be reckoned with, as Moscow was just experiencing a temporary setback in the late 1990s it would overcome within a few decades. So this guy was the key diplomat who changed us from seeing the possibilities of Russia in the 90s to seeing them only as a potential imperial power that we must constrain. Surely Brzezinski never trusted Putin and saw him as the post-Soviet man, a product of Soviet imperialist indoctrination, who felt deeply humiliated by how the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact collapsed. But he predicted escalation of the situation in the East long before Putin took power, and much earlier than most of us, possibly because his geopolitical insights were strongly influenced by the work of a guy named Mayen, Mackinder, Spikeman, and Frederick Ratzel. I'm going to get into all this for you, so don't worry about those names. I'm going to show you a couple of pictures that are going to explain the theory that he took from them, which he's considered a genius for, which, by the way, has been debunked and proved wrong. He was clearly aware that the Russian political establishment had not changed so much from the one responsible for Soviet crimes during the Second World War, so he anticipated that who may have ever been in power in Russia follow a similar modus operandi not favorable to Russia's neighbors. For Brzezinski, the problem with Russia was not just one man, but rather a systemic feature of the Russian soul, inherently prone to expansionism, megalomania, and continual fear and insecurities because of the perpetual feeling of being encircled by enemies caused by post-Napoleonic and post-Second World War II traumas and insecurities that are still very persistent in the nation's literature and culture. Brzezinski recognized that as a threat and warned the West about Putin's neo-imperial ambitions and his political operatives engaged in systemically challenging the new global order in 2008, 2014, and 15. He consistently criticized Putin for undermining Russian democracy since the early 2000s. I want you to slow down and really process what I just said. This guy who developed the strategy that we operate on, believes that Russians are defective. He believes that there's something inherent in the Russian soul that makes them expansionist and megalomaniacs and acting out of fear and anger rage. This is the bigotry and bias that the Russians have been talking to us about for 20 years. You know, you never get any of the commentary from Russia presented to you as anything but propaganda or anything but lies. And that's terrible, by the way, because Russia's a normal nation now. It's not the Soviet Union. Putin has problems. They are dictatorial. They are more aggressive and militant. Yes. They're not quite as bad as maybe Saudi Arabia, right? But so since we don't ever listen to them and we're told nothing they say is valuable, you haven't heard this. The Russians have been complaining about being treated like they're defective for 25 years, ever since we started this policy. And they're correct, and that's exactly what we've done. Now, let me get into this a little more deeply for you, okay? Let me zoom this up just a touch so we can really see these relationships. So Zbigniew, who by the way, he made several predictions. He predicted that the Russians would never fight, right? You know, but there were people who disagreed with him, okay? But what he did is he basically got Carter to replace his Secretary of State, because Warren Christopher wasn't going to go along with this. That's Bill Clinton's first Secretary of State. Madeleine Albright becomes Secretary of State in 1997, replacing Warren Christopher, and cements in this new strategy. She's basically Brzezinski's her mentor. There's also a character in here named, and by the way, she's born in Czechoslovakia, hates Russia. Brzezinski's born in Poland, hates Russia. You understand? These are the personal animuses of them that are informing them in many cases, not any serious geopolitical analysis. I mean, if you believe Brzezinski's analysis of the defectiveness of the Russian soul, you might as well buy into eugenics, Nazism, white nationalism as well. Like, it is so broken to see them that way. And it's no wonder we're at odds with them. Well, that's how the policymakers saw them. So Victoria Nuland gets involved, and she starts working with the State Department at lower levels, but she becomes a trusted lieutenant of Madeleine Albright. She She also agrees. By the way, she comes from her parents from Eastern Europe. She hates Russia as well. She is the modern person who ties all this together. She works in the Bush administration as the ambassador to NATO at that time, getting NATO to fight in Afghanistan for us, right? But she was always focused on Eastern Europe and NATO. And our strategy and policies. And so what does she do? She brings this all into modern diplomatic practice inside the State Department as the instrument of this policy that brings us up through, the coup in 2014, which Victoria Nuland was deeply involved in. All right. So let me show you that I'm not crazy here for a second. So at the time when Brzezinski was coming up with these strategy ideas in the late 90s, right? There was a guy named George Kennan who you may or may not know about, but I'm going to explain who he is for you. George Kennan was the most important diplomat of the second half of the 20th century for the United States. He wrote something called The Long Cable from Moscow. I think it was in 1946 after the fall. So the War II was over, and the Soviets are clearly now amassing military force to take more and more territory in Eastern Europe, and very clearly a communist empire that's seeking to expand its reach. His long cable is like an 8,000-word telegram. Back then, we didn't have the email and stuff. They did things by telegrams, and so it was called a cable because it was transmitted over a cable. That was a short name for it, right? So this cable basically laid out the Cold War and how we were going to oppose the Soviet Union with soft power and indirect hard power. In other words, by arming their adversaries wherever they were fighting, but not fighting them directly. And this is how the Cold War architecture was created and became policy for the United States. George Kennan is considered one of the leading experts on Russia, the Soviets, anybody. By the way, he doesn't come from an Eastern European nation where he hates the Russians. He's a cold realist. By the way, he was such an enemy of the Soviets and the communists. To think that he would flip and become their ally is to miss what actually happened here. So I'm going to read you something from him now. And I know this may seem maybe, not the most viral video I could ever do in my life, but dude, you've got to understand this if you're ever going to get anywhere in understanding how we got here. So George Kennan was still very active in U.S. diplomacy in the 90s, in and around those circles, intellectual circles, academic circles, policy circles. And so he comes out very strongly in the late 90s and is like, this is insanity. And I want to read to you what George Kennan said at the time. I think it is the beginning of a new Cold War, Kennan said from his Princeton home. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies. I think it is a tragic mistake. There was no reason whatsoever for this. No one was threatening anybody whatsoever. The expansion would make the founding fathers of this country turn over in their graves. We have signed up to protect a whole series of countries, even though we have neither the resources nor the intention to do so in any serious way. NATO expansion was simply a lighthearted action by a Senate that had no real interest in foreign affairs. He goes on, I was particularly bothered by the reference to Russia as a country dying to attack Western Europe. Don't people understand? Our differences in the Cold War were with the Soviet communist regime, and now we are turning our backs on the very people who mounted the greatest bloodless revolution in history to remove that Soviet regime. Do you understand yet how insane that was? We decided to turn on the people who overthrew communism without having to have a war. Okay? And the problem is this madness has continued ever since. And so what you see now, and he also, the last thing I want to say to you is he predict that Russia will remilitarize, and eventually this would lead to war, particularly over Ukraine. Ukraine and Georgia were always the two nations that Russia would never, ever allow to be in NATO. And that Putin went to war, did military action with Georgia and South Ossetia, and was it 2007, 2008? When Bush did that insanity with Georgia? And the same thing happened in Ukraine. When we overthrew Yanukovych and put a Western stooge into power, and then began threatening and harassing every Russian interest inside of Ukraine, and of course the Russians. I want to close on this to understand how stupid this all was. I probably should have gotten a little better prepared for this. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put Crimea up on a map here so we can wrap this up. on a sane note that actually deals with reality instead of the craziness you're being told every day. Because my hypothesis here, the reason I'm telling you this is because I simply want you to know the facts and the history of how we got here. We very intentionally treated Russia like a problem, right? So the Russians were like, well, we can't allow a Western-dominated Ukraine to prevent us from accessing our naval base in Sevastopol. Do you understand? Let me make this a little smaller. I've got it too big, so you can see it clearly. This is Ukraine, right? There's the border. There's Russia, okay? Russia has a military base here from the Soviet days that it's always had access to over land, what they call a land bridge. But Russia ends here, right? So they always wanted to be able to get to their Soviet, their naval base here, which, by the way, gives them access to the Black Sea and gives them access to the Mediterranean, right? This is the most important naval base they have in the world. They were never going to give that up. Okay, we're going to wrap up with a much bigger picture view of things and to really understand how we got here. So the grand chessboard is the strategy that informs Brzezinski, that made him into the lunatic that he is, and made him want to basically preemptively restrain Russia. See, they believe in something called the Heartland and Rimland theory. I was going to go down that whole rat hole in this video, and I realized that's too far. But if any of you are interested in the academic background of this, go look up something called Heartland theory and then Rimland theory. What it says is that, and this is kind of okay to use as a strategic lens to analyze things. Just necessarily make your foreign policy on top of it, though. But what they believe is that essentially the Eurasian landmass is so huge and so rich in resources and so well protected from the north and landlocked. It's very invulnerable from navies. By the way, naval power is what takes out nations. Is that it will always become an empire. And this is, by the way, this isn't shared by everybody, but this is a big idea in our foreign policy and international relations that informs guys like Brzezinski and others. They think it's inevitable that Russia was going to become an empire, no matter what, and was going to seek to take the rim around it. And by the way, if you can control the rim around Eurasia, right, all the Eastern European republics, then you can control the entire world. That's the fear. The fear is that we will not be able to be the global hegemon anymore. See, it puts us as the global hegemon. So how are we supposed to contain Russia? By our Eurozone with smaller proxies, right? By neutralizing China and making sure they don't ally with them. And also, by the way, bolstering China was part of this strategy. It was to offset Russian dominance in Asia. So we poured all that money into China and made them the global hegemon competitor to us in order to offset Russia. Do you understand how crazy these people are, who actually the brilliant strategists, which inform everything we do, right? So they saw why, and so why are we so interested in dominating in Asia? Because we want to prevent this empire from emerging as well. So in this ring of islands and this whole American zone, this is how we treat this. This is how we view the world in a post-Cold War world and the threat from Russia. And what we want is chaos in Russia. And so what we constantly did, starting from the late 90s, is use our intelligence forces, our propaganda arms, U.S. aid, by the way, which Putin threw out of Russia in 2012 because of its constantly advocating against Putin and trying to undermine him and foment revolution, all these other things. That, by the way, if they did here, we would call it treason. We would call them acts of war. We would throw their diplomats out. Like what USA does in nations like Russia, we never would allow Russia to do here. Yeah? And when we talk about them influencing elections, man, we're 1,000 times worse than them. So I just wanted to give you this clear sense of what the strategic thinking is that our leadership never tells you about. Yeah, never describes to you, never brings you in on what you get. And remember how crazy this was. And last thing I want you to understand is the pushing and pulling inside of our own foreign policy leadership and political leadership, right? Particularly political leaders on the outside of this who are not steeped in deep foreign policy and understanding how committed the CIA, the NSA, the National Security Council, the Defense Department, and many of their strategists and thinkers are to this line of thinking. Obama comes along. He's not bought into it. What you watch is how Obama is co-opted by the deep state. So in 2009, it's reset with Russia, right? Same thing with Bush, by the way. Early in the Bush administration, I could see in his eyes. I looked in his eyes and I saw who the man was. Same thing with the naive people. Like in the Obama administration, Hillary knows better, but she's going to go along to get along, right? That's the way she's always been. So they press this opening to Russia. My sense is that was never real. My sense is that was a trap to set us up as the morally superior ones again, because after Georgia in 2008, when we essentially provoked Russia to war, we weren't looking so clean anymore. And we've been involved in the color revolution there in Ukraine in 2004, and other things that had gone on. So this was a way of sort of making us look like we were the good guys again. And of course, by 2012, we are at each other's throats again. I'll give you a little story about the kind of things, petty nonsense that the Obama administration engaged in to just aggravate and annoy and sort of build up this antagonism between our two nations. When Putin was reelected, whatever, the thing that got him back into power, I can't remember how it all went down. There was, of course, a celebration where other states come and diplomats come, and they participate in the celebration, and it's a way of just being respectful to other nations when they have a change in power, right? So what did we do? We didn't send somebody senior, which we normally would, maybe not Secretary of State to Russia, but a senior diplomat, like an assistant Deputy Secretary of State. We sent somebody much more junior, a flaming homosexual man, right? Where in a Christian society where homosexuality is still frowned upon. And certainly the Putin administration doesn't want to, like, that's just not their vibe. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't have done that. What I'm saying is Hillary Clinton did that intentionally to stick a finger in the eye of the Russians. We do this all the time to them. We spent 25 years provoking them into action. They made clear they would never, ever accept a NATO, a Ukraine in NATO. And do you know what we thought? Because of all our grand strategizing, we believed that Russia would never actually attack. Brzezinski, way back when he was asked about it, he goes, they'll never attack. That's a crazy thought. And then the other question was asked of him, well, won't they draw more allies? Won't they make relationship? And Brzezinski was literally like, well, you think Russia's going to ally with China? Which is already happening. He said that was impossible. What do you think? They're going to get help from lesser countries like Iran? You're crazy. They're getting armaments from Iran every day and have deals. And they're actually building an entire alliance system outside of what we've done that opposes us, that Brzezinski never predicted would happen, and is provoked and comes into being because of our aggression, not theirs. You're never told the truth of this. I do not like Putin. I am not vying for Russia here. I am vying for sanity, reality, facts, and evidence, and for us to be held to account for our policy decisions. And when we provoke a nation to war, that we look ourselves squarely in the eye and say, what are we doing here? And does it make sense? I hope this was helpful to you. I know it was longer and not the sexiest video I've ever done, but this is maybe one of the most important ones that I've ever done. Thank you. Glenn with War for the West.